Does sugar actually cause heart disease? I guess I get asked this question pretty much every single day on my social media profiles. Literally almost every single comment in the social media, under any video, under any post I make is just cut out sugar, cut out carbs, stop eating grains, and you will fix heart disease. Your cholesterol will go down. Sugar causes heart disease. Sugar causes cholesterol, blah, blah, blah. So first of all, it's a very nuanced and in-depth answer. I don't have enough time usually in the comments to give that exact question the detail and the nuance it deserves. So here's the long form video on this. If you don't know me, I'm Dr. Allo. I'm a double board certified cardiologist. I deal literally with cholesterol problems every single day. I'm also writing a book on cholesterol. You can go to drallo.net/cholesterol. And if you go to my blog, there is an in-depth discussion on this exact topic. Does sugar cause atherosclerosis? Does sugar cause heart disease? Go to drallo.net/blog. You can click on any of the links on any of my social profiles. It'll take you straight to my blog and you can read about this. So this is a nuanced question. Does sugar in and of itself cause heart disease? And then how can sugar cause heart disease? Let's say there are ways wherein sugar can exacerbate and or cause heart disease. We'll get into that. But if your question is just the simple question of, does sugar in and of itself, by itself, cause heart disease? The straight up answer is just no. There is no way, no direct way in which sugar by itself can actually cause heart disease. However, there are ways in which sugar can worsen or exacerbate atherosclerosis. And when we talk about heart disease, that's generally what we're talking about. Atherosclerosis, the plugged up cholesterol deposits in your arteries, which is what causes atherosclerosis. So let's rewind a little bit. What actually causes atherosclerosis? So first of all, it's a lot of things, but usually the number one thing that we now know, it is high LDL cholesterol. It's lifelong exposure to high LDL cholesterol. And that in and of itself, by itself, is sufficient and necessary to cause atherosclerosis. This has been tested. You don't need inflammation. You don't need insulin resistance. You don't need smoking. You don't need hypertension. You do not need endothelial damage. A lot of people think that something causes damage to the endothelial lining, and that is why you have atherosclerosis. I've gone over that multiple times. They've actually done those studies where they go in and scratch your endothelium and see if atherosclerosis forms there. It does not. You need intact, healthy, uninflamed, normal endothelium to have atherosclerosis. Now, this is not something new. This has been known for a very long time, but it seems like every few years there's a crowd of these internet medfluencers and people promoting a bunch of nonsense like, oh, it's not the cholesterol, you need sky high cholesterol. And then they go through and they cite like one or two cherry picked studies and they don't look at all of the data. So I put this graph up a million times. When you look at all of the data and you do not exclude anything, you do not cherry pick any studies, and you look at all of the data combined, LDL cholesterol causes atherosclerosis. Now, let's talk about sugar. So those of you who've read my book, Actual Weight Loss, there's a lot of discussion on sugar, weight loss, how to gain weight, how to lose weight, and how, sugar affects weight loss or does it. If you have, let's say you have high ApoB, high LDL cholesterol. If you have high ApoB, and on top of that you smoke and have hypertension and you are obese and you have diabetes and you consume too many calories from sugar, then sure, sugar can lead to it. And we'll get into the exact mechanism in a little bit. But independent of obesity, let's say you're pretty lean, you're athletic, you're healthy, you eat the right amount of calories, you eat enough protein, all of that, you do everything right. You're eating a balanced Mediterranean diet, not a lot of saturated fat, not a lot of, anything, balanced diet, doing well. Your ApoB numbers are under check. Let's say your LDL is like 44, 45, 55, whatever, pick a number you like, well under 70, hopefully under 60 is even better. All of that is fine. And you start to overconsume any and all calories, right? Let's say you even overconsume fat, you overconsume, let's not say fat, because fat in and of itself has a mechanism of elevating LDL cholesterol. So let's assume you're not eating more fat. You're eating more carbs and you're eating more protein. And you gain weight. You've held fat constant so that kind of takes that out of the equation. You gain weight. You gain 20 pounds, 30 pounds. Now, because you have the genetics for diabetes, you insulin resistance creeps up. You now have more inflammation because obesity in and of itself raises inflammation. Obesity causes inflammation. It is one of the main causes of actual inflammation. You can read about that in Actual Weight Loss, in my book. Now, you gain weight, but your ApoB is really, really low. You're not going to have atherosclerosis. We know that, people who are born with genetic mutations that have something called hypo-beta lipoproteinemia, where their cholesterol, beta cholesterols, your ApoB, beta lipoproteins are super low, they do not develop atherosclerosis. So if you're in a state of hypo-beta lipoproteinemia, whether it's diet-induced, genetics-induced, or medication-induced, the chances of you having atherosclerosis, if you have hypo-beta lipoproteinemia over a long enough time horizon, is very minimal. Now let's take the opposite example. You take somebody whose LDL is high, 130, 125, 110, 115, something above 100. The cutoff is 100. And they're lean and healthy, and they do the same thing. They eat more protein and more fat. They gain weight, or I'm sorry, not fat. Obviously, fat would raise your LDL. You eat more protein and carbs, which are sugar. Let's say it's just sugar. You eat more protein and carbs, now your body mass goes up, you put on some fat, inflammation goes up. If you have the genes for insulin resistance, that starts to creep up. You now have more insulin resistance. You become hypertensive now, what have you. All of these things, that is a way in which excess calories, regardless of where they come from, can worsen outcomes. Not even directly because it's raising your LDL. Let's say your LDL never even changed. You're just eating more protein, more whole grains. You're sticking to carbs, but they're like wholesome carbs. They're like broccoli, whole grains, whatever, nuts, seeds, beans, proteins, legumes, nuts, whatever. Healthy carbs that are otherwise not quote unquote ultra processed. We're not talking like Twinkies and donuts here. You're eating healthy carbs. Equally, diet, your LDL is held constant. Let's say it's 120. LDL is the same. Because you now have insulin resistance and you're obese and your inflammation has gone up, the increase in body weight in and of itself increases inflammation. And when you have insulin resistance, this affects your lipoproteins in such a way where it prolongs the plasma half-life and the plasma residence time of lipoproteins. So your ApoB lipoproteins will be in circulation a little bit longer. Now, obviously, this will raise your quote-unquote ApoB and HDL cholesterol, so we can't really hold it constant. But that is a way in which sugar can worsen outcomes. Now, no one is suggesting that you have to go eat ultra-processed foods. People say, well, you just tell us to eat ultra-processed. I don't tell you to do anything. No one is suggesting that. In fact, we'll get into the studies on that. Now, if you want the full in-depth studies with live links to each one of these studies that I'm going to go over, if you go to drallo.net/blog and just search for the word sugar, it's probably one of the first few blogs. The word sugar will turn up an article called Does Sugar Cause Heart Disease? And you can go super in depth. It's actually the entire chapter of my new cholesterol textbook that talks about sugar and heart disease, how it can cause heart disease, how it might not, and what are the exact mechanisms, with like hundreds of links to the actual articles. If you choose to read them, there are links to all the PubMed and PMC articles that are live. You can just click and go read them. So let's get into these studies a little bit, because I think it's super important to understand how, if you're into the in-depth stuff and you want to really dive deep, this next section is for you. If you kind of understand the gist of what I'm saying, the quick summary is sugar in and of itself, not going to do it. If you have high ApoB, sugar will raise that if you're diabetic. If you're not, probably not. Sugar will raise inflammation if you gain weight, but so would fat, so would protein, so would anything if you gain weight. So it really matters. Now, the question becomes like, isocaloric diets, substitution diets. What happens if you took out carbs, substituted fat, substituted protein, those kind of things. That is what I think is important to get into next. And I'll go through some of the studies in detail so that you have a much deeper understanding of this topic and kind of know where and how sugar is affected. Now, there's also these people that have this conspiracy theory that think the sugar industry paid off some Harvard scientists to go and lobby the American Heart Association or something to blame fat instead of sugar. which is absolutely false. There is no evidence that this happened. Nobody uncovered some secret documents. This was a nonsense article published by a dentist in some journal that has not been found to be true, not been found to be even accurate. And that is also on my blog. If you go to Does Sugar Cause Heart Disease on my blog, there's a link to the study about the scientist, and then everybody who refutes it, about the dentist, who says that there was this big conspiracy theory in the 1950s where they paid off researchers to blame sugar, or to blame fat instead of sugar, by the sugar industry or the fat industry or whatever it was. And it's just a conspiracy theory. People who believe in these like weird, bizarre medical conspiracy theories, I have a lot of sympathy for them, because they are just trying to blame some outside super force, some super entity. They want to blame big government, big sugar, big cattle, big fat, big bacon, big pharma, big medicine, big healthcare, big whatever, to not have to blame themselves. And I don't think they do it intentionally. They're not like, trying to escape blame. They always talk about personal responsibility and I'm going to take care of my health. But it's much easier to blame big pharma and big government and big sugar and big fat, whatever it is, for all of these things than to just say, look, here's what the data shows. I'm wrong. Shouldn't be eating that much saturated fat. If I do, no big deal. I could talk to my doctor, my cardiologist. And if the way I'm eating is raising my LDL too much and I don't feel like changing the way I'm eating, then fine, they can put me on medications. But if I'm willing to tweak some things and make a few adjustments to bring my LDL back down or whatever it might be, then fine. People say, well, doctors never talk about nutrition and diet. All you guys talk about is medications. No, I literally have hundreds of videos on here talking about nutrition and diet. Some of them are like 3 hours long. But the first thing we would do would be say, hey, listen, your diet is not cooperating with your genetics. Your LDL cholesterol is like 190, 220, 230, 400, whatever it is now. That is diet-induced hyperlipidemia. Over a long enough time horizon, you are going to destroy your arteries. Now, you may feel better, and I feel great, and I lost weight, and my inflammation went down, and my autoimmune disease improved, and I built muscle, and I lost fat, and I lost 20 pounds. A lot of the health benefits come from the weight loss alone. A lot of the health benefits come because it's a elimination diet. One of the biggest things that was, proven by Dr. Mark Haub, he's the head of nutrition at Kansas State University. He wanted to prove that you could eat literally garbage, lose weight, and still improve your health markers. So he did this thing called the Twinkie diet. For 10 weeks, he ate basically only Twinkies. He did eat 100 grams of protein a day in the form of a shake because he's smart. He's the head of nutrition. He doesn't want to lose muscle. He did make sure he got enough fiber, but the rest of his diet for 10 weeks was basically Twinkies, Doritos, Oreos, cookie, Little Debbie snack cakes, garbage, convenience store, gas station food. For 10 weeks in a calorie deficit, 1,800 calories a day instead of 2,600, lost 28 pounds. All of his health markers improved somewhere between 20 and 30%, depending on which one you're looking at. We're talking like LDL cholesterol, inflammation, total cholesterol, lipids, triglycerides, what have you. All of that stuff that was measured, all improved. Go watch my video on here called the Twinkie diet if you want, details on that, or Google Dr. Mark Haub Twinkie diet. There's also a blog article on my blog about it. So regardless of what you do to lose weight, for the vast majority of people, losing weight, you will feel better and most of your health markers will improve. Now, there are some exceptions to this rule. If you are doing a keto style diet where you are eating a lot, or carnivore, and you're eating a lot of saturated fat, this is like fat from red meat, butter, bacon, lard, cheese, chicken skin, fat on steak, basically animal-based fats, you are going to increase your LDL cholesterol and increase atherosclerosis. There's just no question about it. I have an entire blog article on red meat and another one on carnivore with live links to all of the studies in my blog. You're welcome to go read those, as well as my summary of some of those, of all of those studies. You can go read it and decide for yourself. Don't let the carnivore crowd confuse you. Don't let the vegan, vegetarian crowd confuse you. Humans are designed to be omnivores. We are designed to eat anything and everything that is available to us. Some people do better on this diet, that diet, what have you. But for the most part, most human beings seem to have the least amount of atherosclerosis, least amount of dementia, least amount of problems if they stick to a Mediterranean diet. And a lot of people say, well, what happened when we started doing the pyramid, the food pyramid? Look what happened. We got more obese. So first of all, no. We did not get more obese. Nobody actually followed the guidelines or the pyramids. Everybody just consumed more calories, usually in the form of ultra-processed, kind of highly available, cheap junk food that is hyper-dense, hyper-palatable. You love eating it, high calorie counts, and it's easy to put on weight. In fact, if you look at the data and the studies, and this is also my blog article on sugar, all of the studies show that sugar consumption has actually gone down while meat, protein and fat consumption has actually gone up. So people are like, well, yeah, we're eating more sugars and grains and carbs. We're not actually. There is a slight decrease at every single level of BMI. There has been a decrease in the amount of carbohydrates that we eat. So with that all said, now those of you who want to deep dive, kind of like stick around, I'm going to go through some of the studies, and it's super fascinating what happens when you substitute isocalorically fat for sugar, fat for this kind of fat, carbs for this, carbs for that. So I'm going to go through some of these, and I think you guys are going to really be fascinated by this. One thing I will point out that I forgot to mention is that of all the people that are admitted to the hospital with ACS, acute coronary syndrome, heart attacks, whether it's unstable angina, ST elevation MI, or non-ST elevation MI, only 25 to maybe 30% actually have diagnosed diabetes. So people are like, no, it's the diabetes that causes heart disease. It's the insulin resistance. No, it's not. The other 75, 80% of people didn't have that. So of all the people that had heart attacks, only 20, 25% actually had diabetes. Now you can argue, well, what about the people that have prediabetes and insulin resistance and don't know about it? As a percentage of the total population, depending on which study you look at, it can range anywhere from 9%, which is diabetics, 9 to 10% of the population is diabetic, so let's say like 9%, all the way up to maybe like 35, 38%. So still the numbers don't add up. If you're going to, but all of these people had high ApoB. All of them had either high lipoprotein A or high ApoB. So that is not a question. There's a whole other video on how come how come 75% of people who had a heart attack had normal LDL cholesterol. That's a whole other video. I highly recommend you go and watch that one. So let's get to some of these studies. In the women's health study, in the Iowa Women's Health Study, they found that the women who ate the most amount of whole grains had a reduced, which are carbs obviously, had a reduced risk of ischemic events, ischemic heart disease. So whether it's heart attacks, strokes, leading to CHF, heart failure, etc., they had the least amount of ischemic heart events. Now, if you want to look at all of the studies that have ever been done on carbohydrate intake, I highly recommend you go to the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition, start at section 5.8. They go over all the data on carbohydrate intake, and there was no association with carbohydrate intake or sugar intake and any form of heart disease. Let me say that again. There was no association with carbohydrate intake and any form of heart disease. So not just ischemic heart disease, but any form of heart disease. Let that sink in for a little bit. So another study that was done looked at saturated fat, unsaturated fat, and simple sugar intake. Participants were made to consume an extra 1,000 calories per day of either saturated fat, unsaturated fat, or simple sugars, simple carbs. They measured pro-atherogenic properties of LDL particles like particle aggregation, proteoglycan binding, oxidized LDL, as well as concentrations and composition of plasma lipoproteins before and after the overfeeding. They found that LDL particle aggregation increased in the saturated fat group, but not in the other two groups. They also found that proteoglycan binding, which is what retains LDL particles in your endothelium, they also found that proteoglycan binding of plasma lipoproteins decreased in the unsaturated fat group. This prevents the endothelium from retaining LDL particles. They found that no lipoproteins changed with increased sugar intake despite consuming an extra 1,000 calories per day of simple sugar. Saturated fat increased LDL particle retention, which is why saturated fat is so atherogenic. And of course, in my actual article on the blog, there are links to all of these studies. You are welcome to go read them and refute them if you feel that you can. Another study looked at high-risk vascular patients who were not on lipid-lowering therapy. They selected patients from the 4S study that had low HDL-C and high triglycerides to see who benefited the most from statin therapy, if at all. They found that those with the highest triglycerides and lowest HDL, which are people obviously with metabolic syndrome, achieved an enhanced clinical benefit from starting statin therapy compared to patients with low triglycerides and high HDL. The group with lower HDL, I'll skip the rest of that because it's kind of long. But basically what they found is that if you have metabolic syndrome, like and even diabetes, for example, you actually benefited the most from lipid-lowering therapy per millimole reduction in LDL cholesterol. So if you took non-diabetics versus diabetics, you lower their LDL cholesterol by the same amount, let's say 1 millimole, which in American is like 38.6, let's just say 38. You reduce everyone's cholesterol, LDL, by 35. For every 1 millimole reduction in LDL cholesterol, the ones who had diabetes had a 7%, had an extra, I forget what the number was, 7% greater reduction in risk. I'm sorry, I think it was 52%. It was a 52% reduction in risk compared to those who we lowered their LDL cholesterol without insulin resistance. So obviously the insulin resistance adds even more risk to these people, but the ones who benefited the most from each additional amount of lipid lowering were the ones who had insulin resistance. So a lot of people are like, well, what if I just make my insulin resistance go away, then I won't have heart disease? That is not true. You are at the most risk, and insulin resistance is not going to go away. It is genetic. You can improve it. You may even, if you lose enough weight and do enough of the right things, if it's not too, severe of a genetic disorder for you, you may even reverse it to the point where you don't need medications anymore and it's at bay and we can kind of just watch it. But for the vast majority of people, it's not going to go away completely. You'll have at least some amount of insulin resistance. And if you are not on lipid-lowering therapy, you are at 2 to 3 times the risk of your exact twin with the same exact LDL level for the same exact number of years without insulin resistance. So the insulin resistance folks, to their matched twins, matched cohorts, had a 2 to 3x risk. And of course, like I said earlier, patients admitted to the hospital with heart attacks, only 25% of those actually had insulin resistance. So still the rest of them, the other 70, 80%, still had heart attacks without anything other than just elevated LDL cholesterol. So keep that in mind. Now, another study found that in obese patients, diabetes modulated cholesterol metabolism more than obesity alone. So if you were obese versus obese with insulin resistance, it was worse in terms of your lipids and lipoproteins. And we know that obesity in and of itself is a driver of inflammation. I've talked about that incessantly and posted all the studies. They are all also in my cholesterol book and that blog article on sugar. Does sugar cause heart disease? Without controlling for calories and protein, it's very difficult to make many conclusions on sugar intake and various health markers. Because if you are eating sugar and it is increasing your body weight, then lots of things go wrong. If you are eating sugar and losing weight, then lots of things can go right. For example, there's that Chinese study where they fed Chinese men, only white rice, only carbs, simple carbs, and they lost 100 pounds each. Their inflammation went down, they reversed their diabetes, their cholesterol markers all went down, like everything improved. Eating just pure white sugar in a severe calorie deficit, they lost 100 pounds. I mean, that is fantastic and kind of proves the same with the Twinkie diet. The guy basically just ate junk food, ultra-processed junk food, really, and all of his markers improved because of the weight loss alone. Now, that doesn't happen in everyone, but the vast majority of people, regardless of what macronutrients you emphasize, as long as weight comes off, you will more than likely reap some significant health biomarker benefits, as well as obviously like health benefits long-term. In the Framingham Heart Study offspring cohort, there was a significant decrease in the amount of calories from total carbohydrates and total sugar over 17 years. We kind of discussed this earlier. Over that period of time, there was actually a significant decrease in the amount of sugar that people have consumed, whereas protein and fat intake has gone up. Studies where they have substituted saturated fat for sugar in an isocaloric fashion have not shown adverse outcomes and have shown benefit due to reduction in saturated fat intake alone, because we know that generally lowers LDL cholesterol. One study showed that substituting saturated fat for carbohydrates in an isocaloric fashion reduced visceral fat and subcutaneous fat. So even if you took out saturated fat in a 1-to-1 isocaloric ratio with carbohydrates, let's say you subtracted 500 calories a day of saturated fat in one group versus 500 calories a day of carbohydrates in another group, the group that eliminated the fat actually improved their visceral fat. And we know visceral fat is very pro-atherogenic, inflammatory, all that kind of stuff. It is worse generally. This is like the fat that is around your organs mainly, and is the kind of fat that we generally don't want to have. Another study showed no association between carotid intima medial thickness. This is your carotid arteries. We'll measure it with an ultrasound. No difference between CIMT thickness and increased sugar intake. So they overfed these people sugar over a long enough time horizon, and they found no difference in the intima, the thickness of the intima. Another study looked at isocaloric diets that were enriched with either carbohydrates, saturated fat, or protein. They wanted to look at endogenous cholesterol production by measuring lathosterol levels. And lathosterol levels is a cholesterol synthesis biomarker. When your body increases cholesterol synthesis, lathosterol goes up because it is like one of the last few steps of the intrinsic cholesterol making pathway. They had the participants cycle through various diets and measured various markers. They did each diet for 6 weeks. The high-fat diet showed a 26% increase in lathosterol, meaning 26% increase in synthesis of cholesterol. This demonstrated increased endogenous cholesterol synthesis. Your body started making its own cholesterol. The weight of the individuals did not change during the trial period, so we know that that was not contributing. That kind of confounder or variable was taken out of the equation. Their weight was stable, so they were not consuming excess calories. The high sugar diet and high protein diets had no effect on lathosterol levels. So whether they ate high sugar or high protein, cholesterol synthesis did not go up. The lathosterol did not change. Lathosterol decreased by 10.1% on the high protein diet when compared to the high carbohydrate diet. So protein versus carbs, your body actually started making a little bit less lathosterol, which is a biomarker again for cholesterol synthesis. So isocalorically, if you were to substitute a little more, same amount of protein, 2 extra 100 calories a day of protein versus carbs, you may actually reduce cholesterol synthesis. Now, this hasn't been validated in a lot of studies, but in this study, that is what they found, a 10.1% reduction. Another study wanted to test whether consuming excess amounts of sucrose increased inflammation in overweight humans. So they already took people who are already overweight, so they're already a higher level of baseline inflammation, presumably. They divided subjects into 2 groups. One group increased sucrose intake by 151%, and the other group reduced sucrose intake by 42% for 10 weeks. The group that increased caloric intake by adding sugar to their diet gained 1.6 kilograms, so we know they were actually in a calorie surplus. And the group that reduced sugar intake lost 1.2 kilograms, so we know for sure they actually reduced sugar intake. They measured CRP, an inflammatory marker. There was no difference between the groups after 10 weeks. They adjusted for changes in energy intake and body weight changes. Consuming more energy in the form of table sugar did not increase CRP or inflammation. So in that same Framingham Offspring study, they found that each additional daily serving of ultra-processed foods was associated with a 7% increase in incident CVD, cardiovascular disease. There have been studies that have shown reducing saturated fat is beneficial, but you are replacing it with also matters. If it's ultra-processed foods or refined sugars, it is not as beneficial as more wholesome food options. Now, this is all to say that, look, the conclusion of all this, like you don't want to get lost in the details. Oh my God, what should I eat? Oh my God, what should I eat? The problem with these health influencers and even me, when I get out there and I start digging into the details and like throwing out stuff like this, like some of these, your favorite podcasters, get so deep into the details. People are like, oh my God, what should I eat? I don't know what to do. This person says that and this person says that. Look, eat an overall healthy style diet. The stuff that you're supposed to eat, fruits, vegetables, nuts, legumes, lean meats, stuff like that. Make sure it's not a lot of fat. I mean, if you want to keep it simple, eat a lot of fruits and vegetables, nuts, things that come from nature, things that are wholesome, whole foods, basically, whole foods, plants, everything, like that. Add in some lean meat, and that does not exclude red meat. You know, if you really want to eat red meat, eat it. Just make sure it's the leaner cuts. Don't go crazy on it. Keep everything processed out of your diet. In general, you can eat it here and there. Don't go crazy, you know, don't kill yourself. But even processed meats, those are a little more inflammatory because they have a lot more saturated fat and a lot more salt. Saturated fat and salt are some of the two most pro-inflammatory things that we have. So keep it simple. Check your lipids. If your LDL is higher than it was, we need to make some tweaks. Cut out the chicken skin, cut out the ribeye once a week, you know, eat filet mignon instead of the ribeye, you know, don't eat the ribs. You know, people love ribs. Well, you're basically eating like a hunk of fat and a little bit of, you know, meat on a bone. So try to keep processed foods and fast foods and junk foods and all that stuff to a minimum. 15-20% of your diet is fine, you know, maybe a little more here and there. Like, don't be obsessed and, you know, obsessive compulsive about it, and don't let it drive you crazy and have like this fear of food. I'm all about like food freedom, but if your LDL is high, we have a problem. Now, check your LDL. If it is normal and it's well controlled, and by normal to me, it kind of depends. All comers under 100 is normal. If you've had an ischemic event, then you need to be, if you have one risk factor, you need to be under 70. And risk factors are like obesity, diabetes, hypertension, family history, you know, stuff like that, just a risk factor. If you've had one ischemic event, heart attack, stroke, peripheral artery disease, stents in your legs, ischemic bowel, whatever, you need to be under 55. If you have an elevated lipoprotein A or repeat ischemic events, then you need to be under 40. Keep it simple. Watch my video on LDL cholesterol for that one. That is kind of the summary. If you want to keep it simple, you don't have to eat sugar if you don't want to, but don't fear carbs. Whole grains and fruits and vegetables that actually contain sugar and are basically just sugar and fiber and things like that have actually been shown in almost every study to reduce atherosclerosis, ischemic heart disease, every form of heart disease that you can think of, like the study showed. So don't fear sugar just because you fear sugar. However, if the sugar is in hyperpalatable foods and once you start, you can't stop eating, that's a different story. Then we're talking a totally different game. Now we're talking, you gotta stop eating the, you know, processed carbs and the, you know, Pop-Tarts and Cheerios and donuts, whatever it is that it is making you not able to control your calories. You know, it's a whole other story. Watch some of my weight loss videos on here. There's a whole playlist called the Ultimate Weight Loss Playlist. Go watch that. If you actually get through the Ultimate Weight Loss Playlist on here, you will have a PhD in weight loss. So go, you know, you want to start there, start there. But either way, follow some of this advice. Keep it super simple. If you want to talk to me about this stuff pretty much every day through an app, through text messaging, join my community. If you want to meet with me once a week on Zoom live with me and my friends, join my community. We do this once a week on a live. Go to drallo.net/community, drallo.net/community, and we would love to meet you. And you can cancel at any time. Nobody would even know. If you use the code 1 month, the number 1, then MONTH, all caps, you actually get the first month free. Join us for a month. You don't like it, goodbye, no big deal. But anyways, if you like stuff like this and you don't want people to keep being misled by these crazy influencers online, share with them these videos from an actual cardiologist who looks inside your arteries every single day. But anyways, we'll talk in the next episode. Peace.